The call went out at 9:47 in the evening. Not to a service line, not to a voicemail system, to a cell phone number that the dealer principal had given Earl Mossman 2 years earlier when Earl had signed his purchase agreement for the Massey Ferguson 8S 265, and that had come with a statement that Earl had written in his equipment notebook because he had not heard a dealer say it before, and he wanted the record to show that it had been said. The statement was, "If you have a problem during harvest, call this number first." Earl had not tested the statement in the 2 years since. The 8S 265 had run the 2 previous harvests without an event that required him to call anyone at any hour. It had run cleanly through planting, through tillage, through the summer field work on his 2,400-acre corn and soybean operation in Pettis County, Missouri. It had accumulated hours the way a well-maintained machine accumulates hours, steadily, without drama, in the service of a man who maintained it precisely and operated it within its rated capacity on every job. Earl had not needed to make the call. He had not forgotten the offer. The hydraulic failure announced itself at 9:43 on a Wednesday evening in the 3rd week of October. Earl was running the 8S 265 on grain cart duty, shuttling between the combine and the waiting semis on the field road at the north end of his largest cornfield. The failure was not subtle. A pressure drop that registered on the instrument panel simultaneously with a change in the steering response that Earl recognized before the warning light confirmed what his hands had already told him. He brought the machine to a stop, shut it down, climbed out, and walked around it with a flashlight. The hydraulic line at the cart connection had failed at a fitting, a failure point he had seen on other machines in other seasons and that he recognized for what it was. Not catastrophic, not an internal system failure, a fitting failure at a connection point, which was a field repair under the right circumstances and a shop repair under others, and which in the current circumstances, 9:43 in the evening, a combine sitting idle waiting for a grain cart that was no longer moving, a harvest window that the 5-day forecast was showing would close in approximately 72 hours, was not something that could wait for morning. He called the number at 9:47. The dealer principal's name was Scott Harlan. He had owned Harlan Farm Equipment, the Massey Ferguson dealership in Sedalia, for 14 years, having purchased the franchise from the previous owner when he was 38 years old, and having run it since, with the specific management philosophy of a man who had spent the 12 years before the purchase working in agricultural equipment service, and had developed strong opinions about the gap between what dealer service could be and what it typically was. One of his opinions was that harvest emergencies were not 9 to 5 problems, and that a dealer who was not reachable during a harvest emergency was a dealer who had decided his convenience was more important than his customer's season. He had acted on this opinion by making his personal cell number available to every account above 1,500 acres in his territory, and by maintaining an on-call technician rotation through the 6 weeks of peak harvest season that ensured someone with tools and parts was reachable at any hour. Scott answered on the second ring. Earl described the situation, the failure point, the fitting, the machine's location, the harvest context. He described it in the specific terms he used for everything mechanical, which were the terms of a man who had been operating agricultural equipment for 40 years and who could communicate a failure mode accurately enough that the person on the other end of the line did not need to ask clarifying questions. Scott asked 2 questions anyway, the specific connection point on the cart interface and whether the hydraulic fluid loss appeared to be continuing or had stopped when Earl shut the machine down. Earl answered both. Scott said he would have someone there within 90 minutes and ended the call. Earl walked back to the combine and told his hired man what had happened. The hired man asked what they should do. Earl said they should wait. The hired man had worked for Earl for 11 years and understood that when Earl said to wait, waiting was the correct response and that the situation had been handled. Scott Harlan called his on-call technician at 9:52. The technician's name was Marcus Webb, who had been with Harlan Farm Equipment for 7 years, and who was, at 9:52 on a Wednesday evening, at his home 12 miles from the dealership watching television with his wife. Marcus answered on the first ring because he was on the harvest rotation, and men on the harvest rotation answered on the first ring. Scott described the failure point and the machine's location. Marcus said he would need the hydraulic fitting kit and the line repair components from the shop. Scott said he was already heading to the shop to pull the parts. He told Marcus to meet him there in 20 minutes. Scott Harlan drove to his own dealership at 10 o'clock in the evening, unlocked the front door, walked through the darkened showroom to the parts room in the back, and pulled the components he and Marcus had identified as necessary for the repair. He had done this before, not often because the harvest emergency call did not come every year, but often enough that the process was not unfamiliar, and the parts room layout was clear to him at 10 o'clock at night as it was at 8 in the morning. A dealer who maintained an emergency rotation needed to know his own parts room in the dark, because the calls that triggered the rotation did not arrive at convenient hours. He pulled what he needed, confirmed the fitting specifications against the machine's service record he had on his phone, added 2 additional fittings of the adjacent type that Marcus might need depending on what he found on site, and had everything in a service bag when Marcus's truck pulled into the dealership lot at 10:18. They went through the parts list together at the tailgate of Marcus's truck, confirmed they had what was needed and what might additionally be needed, and Marcus was heading toward Earl Mossman's field by 10:24. Marcus arrived at the field at 11:14. Earl was standing at the machine with a flashlight when the service truck's headlights came across the field road. Earl had been standing there for approximately an hour and 15 minutes, which he had spent examining the failure point in more detail and confirming his initial diagnosis, checking the hydraulic fluid level and the system pressure. Once he had connected a portable gauge he kept in his pickup for exactly these situations, and thinking about what the following 72 hours needed to look like if the repair went quickly. He had not spent the time in frustration. He was not a man who spent time in frustration when the situation had been handled and what remained was waiting. Marcus assessed the failure with his own light. He agreed with Earl's diagnosis. The fitting had failed at the ferrule, a failure mode he had seen before on that connection type under high cycle cart duty, where the repeated connect and disconnect cycles created fatigue at the ferrule over time. He said the repair was straightforward and that he had the components. He said he would have the machine running within an hour. He had it running in 42 minutes. Earl engaged the hydraulics, cycled the system through its range, watched the pressure gauges stabilize at the correct values, and ran the machine at low speed down the field road and back to confirm the steering response was correct and the connection point was holding under movement. Everything was correct. He shut the machine down and shook Marcus's hand and said he appreciated the response. Marcus said it was what the rotation was for and that he hoped the rest of the harvest ran clean. Earl looked at his watch. It was 12:41 in the morning. The combine had been sitting for 2 hours and 58 minutes. In a harvest window that would close in approximately 70 hours, 3 hours was a real cost and not an abstraction. But it was 3 hours, not 3 days. And it was 3 hours on a machine that was now running correctly and would run through the rest of the window without the fitting failure recurring, because Marcus had replaced not just the failed fitting, but the adjacent connection on the same line that showed early fatigue signs consistent with the same failure mode developing. Earl had watched Marcus make the secondary replacement without being asked to, the same way he would have done it himself, because a man who is doing a repair correctly addresses the failure that brought him there and the failure that is coming, not just the one that is already visible. Earl finished his harvest on schedule. The corn was in the bin by Saturday afternoon. The window had closed Sunday with rain. He wrote it all in his equipment notebook: the failure time, the call time, Marcus's arrival time, the repair completion time, the secondary fitting replacement, the total downtime. He noted the date and the weather conditions and the harvest window status at the time of the failure. He noted what Marcus had done and why. He noted that the secondary fitting replacement had been made without being requested. He noted that Scott Harlan had gone to his own dealership at 10 o'clock in the evening to pull parts for a repair that his technician would be making in someone else's cornfield. The notebook went back on the shelf above his workbench with the others. The county farm equipment meeting happened in the third week of January. It was a regular event, 40-some farmers and a few industry people in the meeting room at the Pettis County Extension Office, an annual gathering that had been running in some form since the 1970s, and that had survived the arrival of the internet and the smartphone and every other communication development that had been predicted to make rooms full of farmers talking to each other unnecessary. It had survived because rooms full of farmers talking to each other produced a category of information that the internet did not produce. Specific, verified, first-hand accounts from men who had no reason to say anything except what they had directly experienced, evaluated by other men who could tell the difference between a sales story and an operational report. Earl had attended for 19 years. He had found the meeting useful approximately 60% of the time, which was a higher percentage than most meetings he attended and sufficient to continue attending. He rarely spoke at length during the open discussion. He was not a man who talked without something specific to say, and he had learned across 19 years of attendance that the open discussion period had a limited tolerance for general opinions and an unlimited tolerance for specific accounts. He had something specific to say in January. He did not plan it as a formal statement or position himself as an advocate for any brand or dealership. He was not a man who attended meetings to promote things. He was a man who attended meetings because the meetings occasionally produced useful information, and because occasionally he had useful information to contribute, and the distinction between those two purposes was clear to him and shaped everything he said in public settings. He raised the October breakdown in the context of a conversation that had already started about dealer service quality and the difficulty of getting emergency service during harvest season, a recurring frustration among the farmers in the room, several of whom had experienced harvest season breakdowns in the previous fall, and none of whom had described resolution times that resembled what Earl had experienced. One farmer described waiting until the following morning for a technician who arrived at 9:30 and had the machine running by noon, a total downtime of 14 hours on a breakdown that had occurred at 7 in the evening. Another described a parts backorder that had stretched a repair from what should have been a 2-day job into 6 days. A third said his dealer had a harvest emergency line that he had called twice across 2 seasons and that had gone to voicemail both times. The room had the specific energy of a shared frustration finding its language. Men who had each experienced the same category of problem from slightly different angles, recognizing their individual experience in each other's accounts. Earl waited until there was a pause. Then he described what had happened on October 19th. He described it the same way he described everything, in the specific terms that allowed the people listening to understand precisely what had occurred and to evaluate it against their own experience. He described the failure time, the call, Scott Harlan's personal answer, the 90-minute commitment, Marcus Webb's arrival at 11:14, the repair completion at 12:41, the secondary fitting replacement, the total downtime of 2 hours and 58 minutes. He described Scott Harlan driving to his own dealership at 10 in the evening to pull parts. He described Marcus replacing the secondary fitting without being asked. He said he had been farming for 40 years and had dealt with 7 different dealers across 2 states and had never experienced a harvest emergency response that looked like what he had described. He said he was not presenting it as a typical outcome. He was presenting it as a documented outcome on a specific night with specific times, and that the documentation was in a notebook on his workbench at home if anyone wanted to see it. The room was quiet for a moment. Then a farmer named Dennis Cole, who ran 3,100 acres to the north of Earl's operation, and who had been in the process of evaluating equipment decisions for the better part of 2 years without arriving at a conclusion, asked which dealership Earl was talking about. Earl said Harlan Farm Equipment in Sedalia. Dennis wrote the name in the small notebook he carried to every meeting. A farmer named Glenn Waters, who farmed 1,800 acres in the eastern part of the county, and who had mentioned his John Deere dealer's harvest response time in language that did not suggest satisfaction, asked whether Scott Harlan's personal cell number was something Earl had been given specifically or something the dealership offered generally. Earl said it had come with his purchase agreement, and that Scott had told him it was standard for accounts above 1,500 acres. Glenn wrote something in his own notebook. A third farmer, whose name was Carl Dempsey, and who had been looking at Massey Ferguson equipment for 18 months without committing, asked Earl directly what his overall assessment of the 8S265 was after 2 full seasons. Earl said the machine had performed within the range of what his pre-purchase comparison had projected on fuel consumption and operating cost. He said the 2 harvests before the October failure had been completed without a service call. He said the October failure had been a fitting failure at a high cycle connection point that he had been told was a known failure mode on that application, and that Marcus had addressed both the immediate failure and the adjacent risk in the same repair visit. He said he considered the response to the failure as significant a data point as the performance before it, because a machine that performs well in normal conditions and is supported well when it doesn't is a different proposition from a machine that performs well in normal conditions and leaves you waiting until morning. Carl Dempsey said that was a useful way to think about it. Earl said he thought so. The meeting moved on to other topics. After the formal session ended, and people were gathering coats and talking in the informal way of men who see each other at these meetings and use the post-meeting time for the conversations that don't fit the formal agenda, Dennis Cole found Earl at the coffee table and asked if he could come out to the farm sometime and look at the machine. Earl said he was welcome any time. Dennis said he had been evaluating options for 2 years and had not found a reason to make a move, and that what Earl had described was a reason that felt different from the reasons he had been hearing from salespeople. Earl said the difference was that he had not been trying to sell Dennis anything. Dennis said he knew that. He said that was why it felt different. Dennis Cole called Scott Harlan at Harlan Farm Equipment the following week. He asked if he could come in and discuss his operations situation. Scott said he would be there whenever Dennis wanted to come. Dennis came on a Thursday. He was at the dealership for 2 hours. He drove home without committing to anything. He came back 2 weeks later with his hired man and spent another 90 minutes looking at equipment and asking questions. He signed a purchase agreement for 2 Massey Ferguson 7S.190 units on the second visit. Glenn Waters called Scott Harlan the week after Dennis Cole's first visit. His situation was different. He was not in an immediate equipment replacement cycle and was not ready to make a purchase decision. What he wanted was to understand what the dealership's service structure looked like for accounts of his size. Scott described it the same way he had described it to Earl Mossman 2 years earlier. The on-call rotation, the personal cell number, the harvest emergency commitment. Glenn asked if he could see the rotation schedule for the previous harvest season. Scott printed it and handed it to him across the desk. Glenn looked at it, asked 2 questions about staffing depth, and said he appreciated the transparency. He left without committing. He called back in March with questions about a specific machine. The conversation that March phone call started was still ongoing at the end of the following spring. Carl Dempsey did not call Scott Harlan immediately. He waited 4 months, which was consistent with the 18 months he had already spent evaluating without committing. A man who moved at his own pace toward decisions that he considered carefully and made once. When he called, he asked a single opening question. Was the on-call rotation structure Earl Mossman had described at the January meeting still in place, and was it something the dealership intended to maintain? Scott said yes to both. Carl said he would come in the following week. He came in, he bought equipment. Earl Mossman did not attend any of the subsequent conversations between Scott Harlan and the 3 farmers whose equipment decisions had been influenced, in some measure, by what Earl had said at the January meeting. He had not designed an outcome. He had described a specific event with specific times to a room of farmers who were asking about dealer service quality, and the farmers who had been asking the question had applied the answer to their own situations in the way that farmers apply information, quietly, at their own pace, through their own evaluation process. Scott Harlan heard about the January meeting from Dennis Cole, who mentioned it during his first visit to the dealership. Scott called Earl afterward to say he appreciated what Earl had said. Earl said he had not said anything that wasn't in his notebook. Scott said he understood that. He said the notebook was the point. Earl said the notebook was always the point. He was 68 years old. He had been farming Pettis County for 40 years, and for 2 of those 40 years he had owned a Massey Ferguson 8S.265 that had performed within the range of what his comparison had projected, and had been supported on a Wednesday night in October in a way that his notebook had documented completely, and that he had described to a room of farmers in January because they had asked a direct question and he had a direct answer. The machine was in his equipment shed. The notebook was on the shelf. At 12:41 on a Wednesday night in October, with a repaired hydraulic fitting and a replaced secondary fitting and a technician's truck heading back to Sedalia, Earl Mossman had climbed into the cab of the 8S.265 and driven it back to the grain cart position and put it back to work. He had finished the harvest on schedule. That was the answer to the question the room had been asking. It had always been that simple.